Hi, welcome back. This is Smarter Markets, live at the FT Global Commodities Summit in Lausanne. I'm fortunate to be joined by Helima Croft from RBC Capital Markets. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk with you and get your unique perspectives on geopolitics and their influence on the energy markets. You just came off of a panel where you're talking about shipping, lots of developments there this year. We've had problems with the Panama Canal, problems in the Suez Canal. I was wondering if you could just kind of give us the overview of what sort of impacts are we having? What did you want to discuss with people on this panel?
Well, we have significant disruptions in the Red Sea. And the question that we constantly get is this a temporary phenomenon? Are the diversions of ships around the Cape of Good Hope, is this something that's going to abate? Is there a near-term diplomatic solution? Or are we going to be contending with, constant Red Sea attacks, the Houthis having a much larger brand now in the Middle East as the only Iranian proxy formally in the war? They've seen their stature rise. So are these attacks going to continue? And are we potentially looking at a second front opening up in the Straits of Hormuz? Like in the last 48 hours, we've had senior Iranian officials threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz. The question is not necessarily whether we're going to see a closure of the Straits, because that would be very difficult for the Iranians to accomplish, but could we see a potentially return to 2019? Remember those attacks that took place off the coast of Fujairah after the U.S. ended exemptions for importers of Iranian oil, started with Fujairah, extended to drone strikes on East-West Pipeline, and culminated in the devastating attack on the Abqaiq facility in Saudi Arabia. So is energy infrastructure on the table in a more meaningful way? That, I think, is a question we're trying to contend with now.
And what's your early assessment of that?
My early assumption is a lot is going to hinge on what happens with these diplomatic negotiations, because the Iranians have signaled that if there is a permanent ceasefire, they may stand down on their planned reprisal for the Israeli action last week, where the consulate in Damascus was targeted, where you had 3 senior IRGC generals killed, including the one responsible for running the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force operations in Lebanon and Syria. The question is there a potential deal that would forestall that? Or in the more likely case that we don't get a lasting ceasefire agreement, what is the scope of Iranian retaliation going to be? Because we certainly saw in 2020, after the killing of Qasem Soleimani by the United States, that the Iranians did almost a symbolic response. They called the Iraqi government, said they were going to fire on a base in Iraq housing U.S. troops. The Iraqis called the Americans, gave the warning, and it was a response that, again, was largely symbolic. I think the expectation is it's going to be something more proportional to what we saw in Damascus. So there is real concern that if Iran goes forward with that, you could get into a tit-for-tat escalatory cycle.
And my question for you would be, what do you think Iran's intent is here? Because we've seen their proxies being more disruptive. So kind of when I hear that, I'm like, well, do we really think Iran wants the situation to calm down? Or is this an opening act?
So I think what's interesting is that the Iranians have had sort of very tough rhetoric in support of Hamas. They have, supported the Houthis, but they have been, quick to say they don't direct Houthi action. And so I think the Iranians have chosen to fight this in the gray zone. So continuing to fund their proxies, give them weapons, but not be drawn explicitly into this conflict. And so again, what's interesting is that it was really the Israeli action targeting those senior Iranian officials. And actually, by some accounts, 18 senior Iranian generals have been killed in Israeli strikes since January. Are the Iranians essentially in a position where they feel like they have to respond in order to reestablish deterrence? And so I don't think the Iranians necessarily want to trigger a regional war, but could their response be something that is seized upon in terms of further escalation? I think the question really is also, will the Israelis go into Lebanon like they did in 2006? Because the Iranians have indicated that a return to a 2006 style Israeli action where they roll the tanks over the border, that could be a real catalyst for Iranian entry, because Hezbollah is their most important proxy group. And Hezbollah is the only one that they actually founded. And so the question is, if this expands to Lebanon, is that also a major pathway for this being a much wider regional war?
And what is the scope for the U.S., for Europe, for the West to act? We saw, taking a step back when Russia invaded Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, but the need to keep oil flowing, to keep energy flowing, kind of constrained.
It constrains action. I mean, I think this is, for a larger discussion, and I think a really important discussion, is the degree it's been a limiting factor on multiple American administrations. But we've certainly seen, we're 2 years into this war, that from the outset, a clear goal of the Biden administration was to penalize Russia, but keep the oil on the market. So think about the first round of sanctions where we sanctioned the Russian central bank, the first time a G20 central bank had been sanctioned. And yet we did exemptions for energy transactions. Same thing when we disconnected the major Russian banks from the SWIFT payment system, exemptions for energy. And we think about price caps. Price caps are a response to the EU's sixth package of sanctions, the ban on the provision of services to move Russian barrels that were not going to be welcome in Europe to third markets. In many respects, it was an inflation reduction measure to prevent a major disruption of Russian oil. So the question going forward is, what is in the administration toolkit? We have not significantly tightened enforcement of oil sanctions on Iran, despite the fact that Iran funds these groups that are causing such disruption in the Middle East. When it comes to Russia, we really haven't gone after meaningfully Russian oil revenue because we fear Russian supply disruption. And you look at the latest Russian budget, where they're just spending 6% of GDP on the military and defense, one of the largest Russian defense budgets in history. It's based on a revenue projection that shows a 1/3 increase in Russian revenue. So the question is, has the policy of allowing Russia to retain significant energy revenue prolonged this crisis? And the question is Ukraine basically saying, if you do not give us aid and weapons, the United States being held up in Congress, should we put energy on the table? And we've seen since January a number of attacks on Russian refineries, disruption of Russian product flows. That has not pleased the American administration. The question is, if we do not get the $60 billion release from Congress and the potential return of President Trump, where you could see, further cutoffs in terms of U.S. aid to Ukraine, does Ukraine decide that they have a limited window to defund Russia? And so are these attacks that we're seeing on the refineries, does it expand to actually target export infrastructure? I think that is a really big wild card as we head into summer.
And so as you look, ahead to summer, oil prices, energy prices, what does this all mean? We've already seen oil prices starting to head back up. What do you think in terms of prices and volatility?
It's a lot of potential volatility. And the question for the Biden administration is, if you cannot bring these wars to an end, and it's obviously not the case that the Russia-Ukraine war is going to come to an end, but if Ukraine persists in their attacks on energy infrastructure, so if they do not believe that the aid from the West is material enough to keep energy off the table, so if this pattern continues or potentially accelerates, if the war in the Middle East continues, what's in your toolkit? And so I think obviously there'll be appeals to OPEC going to that June meeting, so it'll be an all-important June meeting. So it is the classic phone call that successive American administrations have made, where you get on the hotline and you call Riyadh. And remember, with the American energy revolution, we told ourselves those calls would not need to be made. And yet, I think it'll be another round of energy diplomacy. And if that does not yield enough barrels to cool this off, and you're looking at retail gasoline prices well above $4 a gallon, do we go back to the SPR?
And how much is there to go to the SPR?
I mean, look, we've already drawn down by $200 million plus. And so we were supposed to be in buyback mode. That has paused. And so the question is, how is there going to be another blockbuster release pre-election? I mean, we're already 360. We're already down, to significantly lower levels. The question is, what's left in the tank to cool energy prices?
Well, there's going to be a lot that we all need to pay attention to heading into the summer. I'm curious, what are the things that you're looking for? It looks like the June meeting of OPEC, the phone calls being made, the, SPR release potentially over the summer. What should people who are interested in where these markets are heading look to from a geopolitics perspective?
I think what happens in the next 48 hours will be really important. I think it'll be incredibly important what is happening on the diplomatic track in the case of this 6-month war in the Middle East. Do we get a significant breakthrough that is de-escalatory? Because if we would get potentially a permanent ceasefire, that would seemingly meet one of the conditions the Iranians have laid out for not a serious reprisal against the Israeli action. The Houthis have said a permanent ceasefire is required to stop the attacks. So if we do not get that permanent ceasefire, I think then a lot more is on the table. Certainly, the Iranian reprisal is on the table for the consulate attack. And the question is, are energy infrastructure attacks back on the table? We shall see.
Thanks for letting us know where we should be watching most closely over the next